The Snow White movies Disney never made. On December 21st, 1937, Walt Disney Productions made history by releasing the first ever full-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Although it was initially expected to be an overwhelming failure, with Walt Disney even risking bankruptcy during its creation, the film was a massive critical and commercial success, and effectively jump-started the company's multi-billion-dollar empire. With the live-action Snow White remake coming out, I wanted to take a look at Disney's other attempts to cash in on the movie that started it all, including the animated prequel featuring a traumatized Dopey, and the live-action introducing her sister, Rose Red. Let's get into it. Because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was such an immediate success, there was a lot of talk about continuing the story, with the animators themselves growing so attached to the characters that they begged Walt to find other projects to include them in. At the time, a lot of Disney's profits came from animated shorts, most of which revolved around Mickey Mouse, Goofy, and Donald Duck. But with the Seven Dwarfs being so popular and recognizable, they became obvious contenders. Walt briefly considered making an animated short that would show what happened after Snow White lived happily ever after, but he eventually wound up scrapping the idea, no doubt because of his well-recorded disdain for sequels. Titled Snow White Returns, the short was supposed to follow the Seven Dwarfs as they prepared for Snow White's annual visit to their cottage. When Snow White arrives, she gets started on dinner, which would include a deleted song from the original film, Music in Your Soup, where she'd teach the dwarves how to eat soup with a spoon like proper gentlemen. And I do wonder if they reused the moment in Beauty and the Beast. The dwarves then try to surprise her with a bed that they made, but they realize that one of the trees they used is still rooted to the ground. By the time they manage to cut it out, Snow White has already fallen asleep in the dwarves' beds, just like when she first met them, and the dwarves have no choice but to squeeze into the bed that they made for her, which is more difficult than they expected. The end. I'll be honest, this is a very unimaginative storyline that provides absolutely no additional insight into the characters or their lives. I know that the Seven Dwarfs were fan favorites, so Disney had no choice but to make them the focus of the short, but by taking place in their cottage and having Snow White teach them manners, it was just more of the same. Instead of Snow White coming to visit them, I think it would have been a lot more interesting to have them go to her, because besides featuring a fun new setting, it also let us see how Snow White's life had changed since she'd gotten her happily ever after. Maybe they could have had the dwarves try to deliver her a birthday pie, only to wind up accidentally destroying it and needing to make another in the palace kitchen, where they make an even bigger mess, only to be helped by the prince, and then they all give Snow White a gift. Although Snow White Returns was never produced, the dwarves did make appearances in a few animated shorts in the 1940s, with the characters being used in a handful of Disney's government-funded propaganda. However, they soon discovered that the sheer amount of characters made the animation process difficult, and the dwarves were soon relegated to merchandise and theme parks. In 1986, a Snow White sequel entered production, but it wasn't made by Disney. A few years earlier, Filmation developed a plan to create continuations of some of Disney's most popular works, but when this got back around to Disney, they sued. After the suit was settled, Filmation had to make changes to the story and its characters to ensure that there were no resemblances to the movie they were ripping off, resulting in a long-haired Snow White and female dwarf elves. Shortly after Happily Ever After was completed, Filmation shut down, and the movie wouldn't be released in the US until 1993. And while not as well received as Disney's, I was personally obsessed with it as a kid, and I think it has the kind of effortless empowerment that Disney has been struggling with lately. Walt was very specific about wanting Disney to create original stories, and even after his death, the company did their best to respect his wishes, until the 1990s, that is. Their first attempt was with The Rescuers Down Under, a sequel to the 1977 film, and it was a box office bomb that barely made back its budget. So they pivoted, and in the hopes of cashing in on the thriving home video market, they created Disney Toon Studios with the express intention of producing direct-to-video releases, most of which would be sequels. This strategy immediately proved itself successful, with 1994's Return of Jafar grossing over $300 million in sales on a $5 million budget. That kind of return is still impressive today. Disney Toons got right to work on even more direct-to-video movies, with everything from Lady and the Tramp to Cinderella to The Little Mermaid getting the sequel treatment. And in 10 short years, over 30 movies were released, some with more success than others. If you saw my previous video about Disney princesses, then you know that in the 2000s, Disney was trying to franchise whatever they could get their hands on, and by pairing up some of their most popular female characters under one label, they were able to bring in billions of dollars of additional revenue. This continued in 2005 with the Disney Fairies franchise, which was spun off from Peter Pan. But with both of these lines being so female-centric, Disney tried to come up with a concept that would appeal to young boys. This brought them back to Snow White, or more specifically, the Seven Dwarfs. Besides already featuring enough unique characters to fill out a lineup, the dwarf format was incredibly easy to replicate. So if they did need to make any new additions, all they had to do was open a dictionary and pick an adjective. Even though a sequel revolving around Snow White would have been a guaranteed hit because of the Disney Princess brand, Disney Toons decided that it wasn't the right course of action, and a computer-animated prequel about the dwarves was pushed into production instead. The project had several writers and directors attached to it before Mike Disa came on board, and along with Evan Spiliotopoulos, they came up with an idea that Disney was happy with. Instead of rehashing the same story beats as the original film, Disa wanted the story to effectively be Disney's take on The Lord of the Rings by exploring the dwarves' culture and history. It would also have a slightly darker tone than most of Disney's other direct-to-video projects and be utterly devoid of any musical numbers. Serving as an origin story of sorts, the Seven Dwarves would begin with Dopey and Grumpy living in a magical village that is threatened by an evil wizard. To save their friends and families, they decide to go on a journey to the ancient city of Dwarfenholm, and along the way, they encounter the 5 other dwarves who join the quest as well. They eventually meet and befriend a beautiful young woman named Narcissa, but she later reveals herself to be the evil wizard's daughter, and the two were tricking the dwarves the entire time to gain access to their ancient magic. Narcissa proceeds to betray her father, enslaving him within the magic mirror, which reveals her to be the evil queen from the original movie. During a battle, Dopey sacrifices himself to save his friends, but they find a way to resurrect him, and in order to escape from Narcissa, the 7 dwarves go into hiding in the woods and build themselves a little cottage. Meanwhile, Narcissa takes over the entire kingdom, where she becomes the stepmother to a very familiar little girl. It's not really related to this video, but I do think it's funny that the evil queen was going to be called Narcissa, because if you're a Disney fan, then odds are you've heard people insist that her name is actually Grimhilda. As I often say, a lot of the things that are insisted upon by the fandom and random BuzzFeed articles aren't actually fact. Yes, Disney has called the evil queen Grimhilda a few times in the past, but they've also called her Ingrid, or in this case, Narcissa. They're literally just making it up as they go along. So please remember that next time someone insists that the prince's name is Florian, when there's literally no evidence of that anywhere. Everyone at Disney was really excited about the Dwarfs project, and believing that it would be a surefire hit, they even planned to make 3 additional films that would follow the dwarves as they made their way home after the evil queen's death in the 1937 film. But in 2006, the dwarfs' future became a little less certain. After Disney purchased Pixar, John Lasseter was made Chief Creative Officer of all of their animation studios, including Disney Toons. Lasseter had been vocal about his disdain for Disney's direct-to-video projects for years, and now that he had control over the entire roster, he made the decision to cancel several projects that weren't too far in development, including sequels to The Aristocats, Meet the Robinsons, and Pinocchio. With reception to the dwarfs concept being so positive, it initially seemed like it would survive this creative shakeup, but soon there was another setback. Higher-ups at Disney requested that Disa make Dopey talk, as they felt that a silent character couldn't lead an animated film. However, they still wanted him to lose his speech, ideally because of some traumatic event, specifically the death of his mother. Disa fought the suggestion tooth and nail, but eventually had no choice but to leave the project because of creative differences. And when this new speaking Dopey concept was pitched to John Lasseter, he pulled the plug on the entire dwarf story. I actually think that Disa's original concept had a lot of potential, especially since it was one of the rare Disney movies with a male lead that was more fantastical than it was science fiction. But there were a couple of things I think could have been improved upon, mainly the main characters. I understand why they made Dopey and Grumpy the leads, considering they were by far the most popular of the 7 dwarves, but if you ask me, the pairing didn't make a lot of sense. Now, we had seen the combination of crotchety and silly work really well in Shrek, but neither Grumpy or Dopey seemed like the type to go on a quest, regardless of how important it was. Not to mention that I think it'd be very easy for Grumpy to just come across as a bully without anyone there to keep him in check. I personally think they needed Doc's level-headedness to start off the film, and he's so full of himself that I totally believe that he'd want to save the day and would drag Dopey along with him. Then you could add Grumpy as the third member of their party before looping in the rest. My biggest problem honestly would have been the switch from hand-drawn animation to computer animation, because as I said in my reaction to the Shrek 5 teaser, I just don't like when they change a character's art style all willy-nilly. Although Disa's concept was officially scrapped, in 2014, Disney revisited the dwarf-centered prequel idea for the animated TV series The 7D. The show took place in the magical kingdom of Jollywood, which the 7D are tasked with protecting. Although it still includes Happy, Bashful, Doc, Grumpy, Dopey, Sleepy, and Sneezy, everything else about the show is completely unrelated to the original film, especially the art style. But if you're a fan of Phineas and Ferb or Gravity Falls, you'd probably like it. I just don't understand why it had to be related to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs specifically. In 2012, 3 separate live-action Snow White movies were released: Mirror Mirror, Grimm's Snow White, and Snow White and the Huntsman. And how funny would it have been if Disney had made one as well? Grimm's Snow White had a lower budget and went straight to video, so I'd bet not a lot of people have seen it. But Mirror Mirror and Snow White and the Huntsman had more of a moment. The two are very different, so we could argue all day about which is better. But what's an undeniable fact is that Snow White and the Huntsman performed better, even getting a sequel 4 years later. Although Disney had experimented with a live-action adaptation in 2010 for Alice in Wonderland, it wasn't until after these Snow White films were released that they decided to take the concept more seriously, no doubt wanting to ensure their hold over the fairy tale genre. This began with Maleficent and Cinderella, which were both wildly successful, and Disney quickly pushed even more live actions into development. This led to an announcement in 2016 that Disney was working on a film based on an unrelated Brothers Grimm fairy tale, Snow White and Rose Red. Unlike the fairy tale that the 1937 film took inspiration from, Snow White and Rose Red followed 2 peasant sisters with very different personalities. One day they rescue a bear who begins living with them, but he tells them that he has to leave in order to keep his treasure away from a dwarf. The girls later meet said dwarf and save his life, but unlike the bear, he's incredibly ungrateful. Eventually the dwarf and bear meet, and in a brawl, the dwarf is killed, turning the bear back into a handsome prince, and he marries Snow White while his brother marries Rose Red. Disney's version would have been pretty different, with them simply adding Rose Red to the usual Snow White story. According to early reports, the film would have begun with Snow White being cursed with endless sleep, prompting her estranged sister, Rose Red, to undertake a dangerous quest with the dwarves to break the curse and bring her back to life. Considering kids probably would have been confused by a version of Snow White without an evil queen and a poison apple, I understand why they combined the 2 fairy tales into one. And as basic as it is, I like it. I mean, apart from Frozen, how many fairy tales are centered around sisterly love? Sure, with Snow White unconscious, Rose Red was probably getting a love interest, who might have been one of the dwarves, but it still would have been interesting to see that familial dynamic play out on screen. And sure, the true love doesn't have to be romantic thing was already done in Maleficent, but I loved it then, and I probably would have loved it in Rose Red as well. But of course, with more businessmen leading Disney than actual creatives, the idea was scrapped before much came of it, and Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs sat undisturbed for several years. Until 2025, that is, when Disney decided to release a live-action remake, Snow White. Now, I've talked about the movie at length on this channel, so I don't want to repeat myself for the umpteenth time, but it's remarkable how much less interesting it is than both the Rose Red and Dwarfs concept. They've been trying to market it as a modern retelling of the story, but everything about it has already been done before. She saves the kingdom from the evil queen in Snow White and the Huntsman. In Mirror Mirror, she's the one who rescues the prince instead of the other way around. Even a non-white Snow White has already been done before, thanks to the fairest of them all. And if they were concerned about the optics of the prince kissing someone who was unconscious, in A Tale of Terror, he just shakes her and dislodges it. So really, what purpose does this movie serve? I'm personally tired of all of Disney's remakes and sequels in general, but if they're going to insist on making more of them, I just wish they'd at least try to be a little more creative about it, because clearly based on the company's history, original ideas are hiding somewhere. I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!